It simmered all night. Guilt, murder, and something sour. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's stir the pot. It was the third Tuesday of the month, which meant three things. Fritz would be experimenting with a new soup base, Nero Wolfe would be in his plant rooms from 9 to 11 with the orchids, and I would be catching up on the pile of correspondence Wolfe called the daily residue of civilization, which, translated from Wolfe to English, meant letters from people who thought he might be coaxed out of his chair by a sob story or a check with too many zeros. I was halfway through an envelope from a woman in Albany who was convinced her neighbor was poisoning her begonias when it started. The smell. Now, I'm not the poetic type, but you don't have to be a bard to know when a smell doesn't belong, especially not in Wolfe's brownstone, where even the air seems filtered for purity and decorum. This wasn't just a bad smell. It was a memory gone sour, something that had once tried to be comforting and failed the audition. It came from the kitchen, which meant Fritz. I made it there in 3 strides. Fritz was bent over the pot on the stove like a confessor at an altar. His face was pale, his ladle motionless. "What in the name of all edible things is that?" I asked, pulling back like I'd just opened a gym bag full of forgotten tuna sandwiches. He didn't answer, just held out the ladle toward me like it was Exhibit A. "Smell," he said, grim. I did, and I instantly regretted it. Now, I've known Fritz for years. I've seen him handle caviar with the precision of a surgeon and dice shallots so evenly you'd think he used a ruler. But this wasn't just a failed soup. This was sabotage. "I followed the recipe," he said, low and almost ashamed. "I tested everything last night. It was perfect. This morning I came down, this." I tilted the pot and peered in. It looked like soup, golden broth, curls of pasta, flecks of parsley, but it smelled like grief mixed with moldy regret. The kind of thing your conscience might ladle out after a funeral you didn't attend. I was about to tell him to ditch the pot and pretend it never happened when Wolfe's voice floated from the hallway. "Archie, come, now," which, translated again from Wolfe to English, meant, "You have precisely 8 seconds before I start yelling." I met him in the dining room. He was standing, not a common pose for the man. His nostrils flared like a bloodhound with a grudge. His eyes narrowed. "That," he said, pointing toward the kitchen like it had personally offended him, "is not Fritz's soup." "No argument there," I said. "It's more like a liquid regret parade, with undertones of what the hell." He turned toward Fritz, who had followed me in, still holding the ladle like a flag of shame. "Explain." Fritz did, from start to finish. How he had prepped the base the night before, sealed it tight, left it to rest, as he always did. How nothing was out of place when he came down except the smell. No signs of forced entry, no broken jars, no unfamiliar utensils. But the soup was not the same. Wolfe listened, not moving, not interrupting. When Fritz had finished, Wolfe's eyes drifted shut for a long moment, like a priest absorbing a confession before passing sentence. Then, "We have had a trespass." I raised a brow. "You think someone broke in? Just to ruin soup?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "someone intended to deliver a message." That got my attention. Because if there's one thing Wolfe takes as seriously as orchids, it's messages, especially when they're coded through ingredients. "Tell me, Fritz," Wolfe said, his voice now calm and glacial. "What was the base?" "Chicken broth, aromatics, lemon peel, parsnip, a dash of rosemary." "Rosemary," Wolfe repeated, eyes still shut. "And the smell?" Fritz hesitated. It's not rot. It's clean, but bitter, like something left behind too long." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Regret." He turned to me. "Archie, bring me the mail. and the jar of rosemary from the second spice shelf, left side. Fritz, you will not dispose of the soup. You will secure it. We will examine it. I didn't ask why. I'd seen this before. Wolfe's instincts bristling like a cat in a thunderstorm. Something was wrong, and not just with the broth. 10 minutes later, the mail was spread on Wolfe's desk. He ignored it. He was sniffing the rosemary like it owed him an apology. "This has been tampered with," he said flatly. Now, I'm not a man given to drama, but something about the way he said it made the room feel colder. It wasn't merely soup, it was a signal. "To who?" I asked. He looked up. "To me." So much for an uneventful Tuesday. I brought Wolfe the jar of rosemary, the one that had sat untouched since a Tuscan hare stew Fritz made last winter. He unscrewed the lid and took a deep whiff, then grunted, a low, displeased sound that for Wolfe was practically a siren. "There's nothing inherently poisonous," he muttered, more to himself than me. "But this is not our rosemary." I knew better than to ask what he meant by our. Wolfe's pantry was stocked like a museum archive, with Fritz acting as curator. No substitution, no improvisation. If this wasn't the jar Fritz had shelved, then someone had done a little midnight editing in our sacred spice library. "You think someone broke in just to swap a seasoning?" I said, leaning against the desk. "If so, I'd say we found the least ambitious criminal in Manhattan." Wolfe didn't rise to the bait. He turned the jar in his palm and narrowed his eyes. "It isn't ambition I'm concerned with. It's message. This was chosen, not to sicken, but to signify." "Signify what? Regret? Mourning? Bad cooking?" He ignored me, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he stood up. Again. That made it twice in under an hour. Something was definitely amiss. "Bring Fritz back," he ordered. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen, no doubt to atone in silence with a fresh mise en place. I fetched him. He returned, looking like a man headed to confession. Wolfe didn't mince words. "Fritz, when was the last time anyone but you or Mr. Goodwin entered the kitchen?" Fritz folded his arms, tight across his chest. "No one. No one would dare." "Someone dared," Wolfe said simply. "Was the back door locked when you came down this morning?" "Yes, as always." "And the windows?" "Locked." Wolfe frowned and glanced at me. "Inventory the spice shelf. All of it. Cross-reference the master list." I saluted. Aye, Captain." That got a grunt. I headed into the kitchen and started with the rosemary jar, then worked outward. The spices were arranged by category, origin, and pungency, a system only Fritz and possibly the Vatican's archivist could decipher. But Wolfe's master list, typed and laminated in triplicate, sat in a drawer by the door. I didn't have to go far. 3 jars in, I found it. "Wolfe," I called. "We've got a swap." They joined me. I held up the offending jar of mace. Label intact. Contents entirely not. Wolfe plucked it from my hand and held it to the light. Then he shook his head. "Anise, deliberate, precise." Again, not for flavor, for symbolism. "Symbolism," I repeated. "You going poetic on me now?" "Anise," Wolfe said flatly, "is often used in funerary traditions. Roman, Middle Eastern, Chinese. The combination of rosemary and anise is not culinary. It is ceremonial." Fritz let out a soft breath. "A ritual?" "Perhaps," Wolfe said, "or a message dressed in the trappings of ritual." I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. "Wolfe, that mail you had me bring earlier. Want me to sort it again?" "Not yet," he said. "This intrusion is not broad. It is intimate. It was meant to reach me, which means the sender was here recently." That narrowed the list. In the past 10 days, only 4 outsiders had crossed the brownstone threshold. A tax consultant with a stutter, Inspector Kramer, grumbling about the color of our front door, Lily Rowan, who had stopped by to drop off a book I never lent her, and "Wolfe," I said slowly, "what about the soup lady?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "She wasn't a client," I said. "She dropped by last Friday, claimed she was writing an article on rare herbs and wanted to ask Fritz a few questions. Harmless stuff. Fritz gave her a tour of the pantry, remember?" Fritz's brows knotted. "Yes. She was polite, curious about the saffron. And she brought us soup," I added. "A jar of something homemade. Said it was a thank you." Wolfe's face didn't change, but something in the room did. A tightening, like when a storm decides it's ready to strike. "Find the jar," he said. I checked the fridge. Second shelf, behind the pickled okra. The lid was still sealed, the label in curling handwriting. "Herbed lentil. For Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Fritz, with thanks." E. Wolfe held it like it was radioactive. "Fritz," he said, "you did not use this in today's preparation." "Certainly not. I never use outside stock, especially not in a new recipe." "Then the message," Wolfe said, "was not in the jar, but in her visit." He turned to me. "Archie, find her. The woman, the article, the publication, all of it. We are not dealing with a journalist." I nodded. "You think she swapped the rosemary while we weren't looking?" Wolfe didn't answer. He just handed me the jar, then turned away, already miles ahead. So much for a quiet week. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, notebook in one pocket and revolver in the other. Not because I expected trouble, but because when someone starts poisoning herbs in our kitchen, trouble usually follows close behind. Finding someone who only left her first initial isn't what I'd call a productive Tuesday afternoon, but lucky for me, she hadn't left just that. She'd also left a business card, which Wolfe had kept in the drawer where we store such sentimental keepsakes as blackmail notes, forged wills, and the occasional threatening poem. I dug it out. Ivory cardstock, thick enough to club a trout with. E. Carlin, culinary archivist. No phone number, just an email and an address uptown on 88th near the park. That told me two things. First, this E wasn't your garden variety food blogger. And second, anyone who uses archivist instead of writer wants to be taken very seriously. Which, in my line of work, usually means they're hiding something. The building was a brownstone like Wolfe's, but narrower, with a blue door and iron railings so delicate they looked like they'd shatter if you sneezed. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked. Still nothing. I waited 2 full minutes the way Wolfe would have insisted, and when that yielded nothing but the faint scent of jasmine and bureaucracy, I took a look through the narrow front window. Books, lots of them, stacked and shelved, wall to wall. Every spine I could make out had something to do with food, folklore, or medicinal plants. No movement, no signs of life, unless the books were breathing. I left a card of my own in the mailbox, then did what any good gumshoe does when met with a locked door and no probable cause. I walked the block and asked around. A dog walker across the street said the woman who lived there had moved in 2 months ago. Quiet, polite, mostly kept to herself. Grocery deliveries twice a week. No visitors, no parties. Her name, Eleanor or Elise or maybe Edwina. She wasn't sure. I thanked her and moved on. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair, but he'd arranged on the desk what looked like a small culinary crime scene. The soup Fritz had made was in a clear bowl, the rosemary and anise laid out beside it, and 2 small amber vials of essential oils were uncorked for inspection. "Nothing," I told him. "Address checks out. Woman's not home. Nobody knows much. Goes by E, something, lives alone, reads too much." "That is not nothing," Wolfe said. "It is the framework of a silhouette. I will fill in the features." He didn't mean with charcoal and sketch paper. He meant with data, detail, and deduction, his idea of portraiture. "Have Saul run a background check?" I asked. Instruct him to be thorough but discreet. I do not wish to spook her yet." That meant Wolfe thought she'd come back around, which meant he thought this wasn't just a warning, it was a prelude. "I called Saul Panzer, who can find out what color socks you're wearing from the security footage of your building's awning. Gave him the name, the address, and the few details I had." He grunted once, which for Saul is practically a soliloquy, and hung up. Wolfe stared at the soup like he expected it to confess. "This is not merely a trespass," he said. "It is an invitation. She is attempting to initiate a dialogue, coded, culinary, and calculated. Seems like a long walk around the block to say hello." Wolfe grunted. "It is a long walk only to those who lack the vocabulary. For someone versed in the language of scent and flavor, this is direct speech." I'll admit I hadn't thought of it like that. But then again, I still referred to my sense of smell by 3 categories: edible, avoidable, and check with Fritz. Fritz entered quietly with a tray, coffee for Wolfe, tea for me, though I hadn't asked. That's one of the things about Fritz. When something's brewing, he doesn't just cook for you, he calibrates. "I've checked every jar," Fritz reported. "No others have been tampered with, just the rosemary and the mace." Wolfe nodded once. "Deliberate, sparse, symbolic." I took my tea and leaned against the desk. "You said earlier it was meant for you. So who did you offend lately?" Wolfe allowed himself a breath. "Mr. Goodwin, you are aware I offend daily, by virtue of existing. But this is not personal in the conventional sense. It is intellectual, philosophical." I knew better than to challenge him when he went Socratic. "So what? She disagrees with your cookbook collection?" "No," he said. "She disagrees with my conclusions." He let that hang, which meant I was supposed to tug on it. "What conclusions?" Wolfe finally took a sip of coffee, as if it were a necessary prelude to explanation. 3 years ago," he said, "I was consulted by the board of an obscure culinary institute regarding a series of thefts from their rare spice archive. A harmless affair. The matter was resolved, the culprit identified. A disgraced botanist who had pawned several antique jars. I offered my findings in confidence, and the matter was settled quietly. I blinked. You never told me that case. I was paid to keep it discreet, and it was trifling, but the spices in question," he gestured to the anise and rosemary, "were among those stolen, unique for their historical significance more than their flavor. Their origin was Ottoman. Their preservation method, rare. Only a handful of experts would know them on scent alone." "And you think Miss E. is one of those experts?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that someone who mourned their theft and questioned the resolution has finally decided to contest my conclusion through performance." That's when the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie Goodwin speaking. The voice was light, female, and threaded with something I didn't like. Too calm. "Hello, Mr. Goodwin. I hear you stopped by my house." I straightened. Wolfe's eyes met mine. I nodded. "Miss Carlin, is it? You may call me Eleanor. I saw your card. I was hoping we could speak about your visit last week." She gave a soft chuckle. "I was hoping he'd recognize the bouquet." "He did," I said. "He's good like that." "Then I've made my point. No need to escalate." "Miss Carlin," Wolfe said, now leaning slightly forward, "you trespassed in my kitchen. You altered an ingredient. That is escalation." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped an octave. "I meant no harm, Mr. Wolfe, only to test your memory and your palate. Test accepted. Now I require context. Would you permit me to visit? I'll bring dessert." That was a loaded question, if ever there was one. But Wolfe merely raised a brow. 8 o'clock, he said. "Come alone." She hung up without another word. I placed the receiver down carefully. "She's coming," I said. "Yes," Wolfe replied. and she is bringing a conclusion she believes I missed. I glanced toward the kitchen where the soup still sat on the counter, untouched. I hope it's not another course. Wolfe's lips twitched. I suspect it is the bill. At precisely 7:57, the doorbell rang. Fritz, who'd been polishing the silver in something close to a nervous trance, looked to me for instructions. I beat him to the knob. She stood on the stoop with her shoulders square, gloved hands folded over a lacquered wooden box. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, slim, composed, the kind of woman who didn't just read footnotes, but corrected them. Her hair was pinned up in a loose knot that looked accidental and wasn't. She wore no makeup, just a slight sheen of defiance around the eyes. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "thank you for not calling the police." "We haven't ruled that out," I said, stepping back. "We're just giving courtesy a running head start." She moved past me with an elegance that wasn't shy, just deliberate. She carried the box as if it were sacred. I shut the door and gestured toward the office. Wolfe was in his chair, the soup still on the credenza behind him, like a witness in protective custody. Eleanor Carlin entered as though she already belonged there, which was the first real strike against her, if you ask me. "You understand," Wolfe said without preamble, "that what you did constitutes unlawful entry and potential contamination of food materials, which, given recent legal decisions, could be prosecuted under criminal statute." She set the box down on the corner of Wolfe's desk, brushed her gloved hands together, and met his gaze. "I do. But I also understand that you're unlikely to call the police over something as esoteric as a ruined broth." That got a slight curl of his lip, which, if you knew Wolfe, meant she wasn't wrong. "I had to be sure you'd remember," she said. "I remember everything worth remembering," Wolfe replied. "Then you remember what you missed." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Enlighten me." She removed her gloves, laid them across the box like a swan's folded wings, and unlatched it. Inside was a small cake, dense, dusted with sugar, and adorned with 2 small violet petals and a sliver of orange rind. "A recreation," she said, "based on the original that went missing 3 years ago from the Spice Archive at the Collette Institute. You concluded that Emery Fliss had stolen it to fund his research." "Which he admitted," Wolfe said. "Under pressure," she said, "and only to protect someone else." Wolfe's brow arched. "Who?" She pointed at the cake. He didn't move. I did. "You think the cake's going to tell us something?" "It already did," she said, turning to me. 3 years ago, Wolfe examined a photo of a table set for 5. 1 seat empty, 1 spoon askew, a velvet pouch of spice resting beside the wine glass. He told the board the pouch had been tampered with by Fliss to cover up the theft, but the board never asked why the spoon was askew. "I assume," Wolfe said dryly, "because I told them it was irrelevant." "It wasn't," she said softly. "That spoon was silver. Sterling. It reacts very subtly with certain oils, particularly anise. In the presence of heat and over time it leaves a faint gray streak." Now Wolfe's lids lowered, and I could practically hear the machinery behind them beginning to rotate. "The anise wasn't part of the theft," she continued. "It was a part of the signal. Someone was warning the board, a silent protest. The person who baked that cake placed the pouch next to it, not as camouflage, but as commentary." "And you believe that person was not Fliss?" "No." Her voice dropped further. "It was me." I looked at Wolfe. He didn't blink. "I was working in the archive then," she said. "A research fellow. Quiet, low clearance. But I knew the patterns. I saw the substitutions. Fliss was stealing, yes, but not for himself. The board was planning to sell off certain rare spices to a private collector in Zurich. Quietly, illegally. He tried to stop them, but when he was caught with the pouch, he took the fall." "And you baked a cake," I said. "Not exactly a whistleblower tactic." She gave me a tight smile. "When your language is scent and taste, you don't shout. You steep. You infuse. You left the institute, Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. I was asked to, quietly, no scandal, no noise, just packed up my spices and went. And now you're here, I said, 3 years later, swapping our rosemary to make a point. She looked at me, then at Wolfe. I'm here because someone finally reopened the Zurich vault, and they used the same blend, the same oils, the same pairing of rosemary and anise. I saw the description in an auction catalogue. Wolfe made a sound like a cork easing out of a bottle. Not surprise. Recognition. The collector, he asked. Dead, she said. 3 weeks ago, in Lucerne. The spices were unaccounted for until now. Then you suspect, Wolfe said, that Fliss's sacrifice was in vain. She nodded. And I believe someone from the board, someone who pressured him into silence, is now selling the rest. Wolfe sat very still. You were wrong, she said almost gently. You solved the theft, but you missed the conspiracy. That, right there, was the line that landed. Wolfe didn't flinch, but he shifted. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, slid it across the desk. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of what looked like labels, casks, handwritten lists in German and French. Beside them, scans of older notes, archives, the original Colette inventory. Wolfe opened the envelope and spread the documents with delicate fingers. Why come now? He asked, not looking up. Because, she said, I need you to finish the case you started. And I need you to exonerate Fliss before he dies. He's dying. She nodded. Liver failure. Advanced. He's in hospice in Rhinebeck. Alone. That made Wolfe exhale. Almost a sigh. Then he pushed his chair back 2 inches, which meant the decision had been made. I will take the case, he said. Thank you, she whispered. But, he added, you will not tamper with my kitchen again. If you wish to communicate, use your voice. She inclined her head. Understood. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, you will accompany Miss Carlin home. Then tomorrow you will go to Rhinebeck. Speak to Fliss. Ascertain the truth. And if he doesn't talk, Wolfe's lips curled faintly. He will. Dying men rarely lie, unless it's for someone they love. I took my coat and stepped to the door. Miss Carlin followed, pausing only once to glance back at the soup on the credenza. It was too much lemon, she said, half to Fritz. He nodded solemnly. Yes. We stepped out into the street. The air smelled of wet brick and nightfall. So, I said as we descended the steps, you always solve your mysteries with cake? She smiled. Only the ones worth remembering. That, I had to admit, wasn't a bad answer. By the time I'd walked Eleanor Carlin back to her front stoop, extracted the final sliver of detail from her about the auction house in Zurich, and watched her disappear behind the blue door without so much as a backward glance, it was past 10. The Upper East Side had gone quiet in that expectant, restless way cities do when something unsaid hangs over the rooftops. I didn't know whether it was the smell of her dessert box still faint on my sleeve or the image of a dying man upstate holding on to a secret for 3 years, but something about this one was already different. Personal, but not to Wolfe. Not yet. When I got back to the brown stone, Fritz had already cleared the tray. The soup had been banished from the premises, his exact words, and Wolfe was in his chair with his eyes closed, not sleeping, just parked in one of those half-lit alcoves of thought where the rest of us weren't invited. I walked her home, I said, shedding my coat. I assumed, Wolfe murmured without opening his eyes. Was she satisfied with her performance? I think she was hoping you'd be less composed, maybe throw the cake across the room or shout Latin. Wolfe snorted. That woman doesn't hope. She calculates I dropped into my red chair. You buy her story? He opened his eyes now and fixed them on me like I was a painting that needed straightening. She's telling the truth about what she believes. Whether that truth conforms to the facts is your burden to uncover. Rhinebeck in the morning? Yes. Take the Lincoln. Saul will meet you there. I've asked him to pull Fliss's medical file and discreetly interview the staff. And Miss Carlin? She will not return. He said it with the certainty of a man who already knew what kind of tea she drank on Wednesdays. I nodded, then leaned forward and dropped my voice a notch. Wolfe, why do this? This isn't our kind of case. It's soft, abstract. We've taken nothing for it. He looked at me a long moment. Then, as if addressing the ceiling, said, Because I made a mistake. Now that was a novelty. Wolfe admitting fallibility was about as common as a snowstorm in Zanzibar. You sure? I overlooked a pattern. I dismissed a gesture. I believe the surface. That is laziness, Mr. Goodwin, and I do not abide it. That was that. The meeting was over. Wolfe closed his eyes again, and I went to bed wondering how a ruined soup had turned into a philosophical reckoning. The next morning I left early. Rhinebeck was 2 hours up the Taconic, more if you counted dodging construction trucks and farm stand vans selling jam out of the back. I pulled into the hospice parking lot just before 9. The place was tidy, tucked behind a grove of pines, the sort of building that tried to look cheerful in shades of beige. Inside, a nurse with auburn hair and the expression of someone who'd heard every last request twice showed me to Fliss's room. Saul was already there, seated by the window in a brown coat that somehow blended in with the fake wood trim. He's awake, Saul murmured as I entered. Coherent, barely. The man in the bed didn't look like a thief. He looked like a scholar who'd made the mistake of trusting his own metabolism too long. Thin but not skeletal, pale but aware. His eyes, when they found mine, were sharp, grey and flicking like he was already reading me. Mr. Fliss, I said, stepping to the foot of the bed, my name's Archie Goodwin. I work with Nero Wolfe. A flicker. Saul had said his name on the way in, I was sure of it. But it still landed. I know, Fliss said, voice dry and creased. The soup man. That stopped me. You heard. I have a radio, and a nurse who talks too loud. Then you know we're not here to gloat. His eyelids dipped. Did he send you to correct the footnote? Close. He thinks he got something wrong? That made him chuckle. An effortful, rusty thing. Well, that's rarer than truffles. Saul shifted but said nothing. He knew when to be scenery. I pulled a chair closer. Miss Carlin visited us. She claims you took the fall for someone else, for the board. She says spices from the Colette Institute are back in circulation, through a Zurich collector. Fliss didn't answer right away. He was watching me, head tilted slightly. Did she tell you what she did? She baked a cake, left it on a table like a postcard. She made art out of betrayal, he said. More than I did. You took the blame. I thought it would be over, he said. Better one scapegoat than a dozen bureaucrats hemorrhaging secrets. But it's not over. No, he said softly. It never is. The Zurich collector was named Halbrecht. He contacted me directly after the auction, wanted authentication, wanted to make sure the spices were real. And they were, which means the board sold them after all. Not all of them, just the rarest, quietly, a bit at a time. You never told Wolfe. No, he said, because I knew he'd fix it. He didn't say that with confidence. He said it like a man turning over a debt note. I've made a list, he murmured, gesturing toward a notepad on the bedside table. What was sold, what's still in vaults. Names. Enough. I picked it up, handwriting in tight looping script, with notes in Latin, German, and some abbreviations I'd need a cryptographer or Wolfe to decode. Why now? I asked. He smiled faintly. Because someone needs to care enough to finish the soup. Saul stepped forward. We'll get you a copy of the Institute's last tax filings. See who moved funds offshore. Fliss nodded once. Then his eyes closed, not with fatigue, but with dismissal. We left the room in silence. Out in the hallway, Saul handed me a folded sheet. Found this in his files. A letter from Carlin, dated last year. She told him what she suspected. Which means she's been waiting, I said. And watching, Saul added. I looked back at the closed door. He didn't want her to fight this alone. No, Saul said. He wanted her to be the one who finished it, but not at her expense. Which meant Wolfe would need a strategy, one that protected both of them and exposed the board without triggering another round of legal whitewashing. We drove back to the city with the list in my coat pocket and the kind of silence you don't break with music. When we got back to the brownstone, it was nearly 4. I handed Wolfe the list, the letter, and the news. He read everything without comment, then folded his hands over the documents like a croupier guarding the last bet on the table. This, he said, will require pressure. You're going to expose the Institute? No, he said. I'm going to invite them to dinner. I blinked. Excuse me? He nodded toward the kitchen. Fritz will prepare soup. Now I really stared. You're going to summon suspects to our house over broth? Wolfe's lips twitched. No, Archie. I'm going to summon them with regret. I've seen Wolfe stage a lot of things, revelations, reversals, full-dress character assassinations, all without leaving his chair. But what he started planning that evening was something else entirely. Not a confrontation. Not an ambush. A dinner. Except, as with most things involving Wolfe, it wasn't about the food. He spent the early evening at his desk, dictating the guest list to me as though he were selecting opponents in a chess tournament. 7 names, all from the Colette Institute's board. Current or recently resigned. Each had been mentioned in Fliss's notes or appeared in Saul's quick scan of the financials. The list read like the table of contents from a culinary think tank. Scholars, consultants, investors, one semi-retired spice baron, and a woman who once wrote a 1,000-page history of cardamom. These, Wolfe said, are the stewards of the archive and the stewards of the lie. You think they're all in on it? No, he said. But enough of them are, and none of them expect to be confronted in my dining room. Why not? Call them to the office like usual. Because the setting must be correct, we must evoke the crime to understand it. They thought of flavor as metaphor. I will return it to evidence. Which meant Fritz was about to be enlisted in something more akin to psychological warfare than hospitality. We called him in. Wolfe laid it out. A 3-course meal, culminating in a soup constructed from the original Ottoman blend that had gone missing. The very same flavors that Eleanor Carlin had tried to signal in her little message to us. Rosemary, anise, lemon, parsnip, but carefully executed. Balanced. A rebuke wrapped in a ladle. Fritz didn't flinch. He took the list, asked 1 or 2 precise questions about proportions, then retreated with the solemnity of a man preparing for a duel. The next morning, I called all 7 invitees. Wolfe didn't want formal letters. Telephone summons imply urgency, he said, and surprise. I played polite but firm. I told them Nero Wolfe required their presence at a private dinner on a matter concerning the Institute's archival ethics. That was enough of a mouthful to pique the academics and alarm the financiers. Some asked if it involved litigation. I said nothing. Some asked if Eleanor Carlin would be present. That one I passed straight to Wolfe, who responded with a single word. Possibly. They all accepted. The night of the dinner arrived like a pressure front. I wore my best suit, not because Wolfe said to, but because it felt like we were hosting a tribunal with appetizers. The dining room table had been extended and covered in white linen. 7 chairs plus Wolfe's at the head. I stood in my usual spot by the office door, ready to usher and observe. The guests arrived in staggered unease. First came Dr. Grinley, a spectacled man who looked like he ate oatmeal for every meal and thought humor was a waste of breath. Then Madame Delacourte, a French preservationist who kissed both my cheeks and then sniffed the air like a suspicious hound. After that came Marcus Averill. Investment chair, tan, loud, with a pocket square the color of bruised cherries. Then the less flamboyant three: Lydia Harrow, records officer, gaunt as a fence post; Colum Beasley, the Zurich liaison; and Jeremy Thane, who smelled faintly of cedar and owned half the real estate east of Lex. The last to arrive, 5 minutes late and without apology, was Eloise Morath, the board's chair emeritus, and the only person in the room whose silence made everyone else shift in their seats. Wolfe sat at the head of the table with a composed weight that sucked the air out of the room without raising his voice. He greeted no one, he simply nodded. Fritz served the first course, a delicate salad of fennel, mint, and slivered citrus. Then the soup came. Golden, fragrant, flecked with rosemary, the exact dish to the nose that had haunted our kitchen just days earlier, but now full-bodied, rounded, anchored with intent. It didn't smell like regret anymore. It smelled like reckoning. The moment Fritz placed the bowls and left the room, Wolfe leaned forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you are not here to dine. You are here to remember." No one moved. The only sound was the faint clink of Averill's spoon as he stirred his soup, unsure whether to taste it or test it for poison. "This," Wolfe continued, "is a reconstruction. A precise formulation based on the Ottoman spice blend stolen or sold from the Colette archive 3 years ago. The notes were recovered, the method was restored, the flavors are not approximate, they are definitive." Morath's gaze didn't shift. "Are you accusing one of us of theft?" "No," Wolfe said. "I'm accusing several of you of conspiracy." Averill laughed, short and brittle. "This is absurd." "I agree," Wolfe said. "That it was allowed to continue this long is indeed absurd. The Zurich vault has been opened, its contents offered for private sale. This is not conjecture, it is fact. Mr. Fliss confirmed it." Grinley set his spoon down. "Fliss? He's alive." "He's dying," Wolfe said with deliberate flatness. "But his mind remains intact, and his conscience, finally, unburdened." "Even if this is true," Beasley said, voice tight, "what does a bowl of soup prove?" "It proves," Wolfe said, "that you recognized it." He let that settle, like steam curling above a pot. Then continued. "Flavor is memory. This blend is not widely known, nor available, yet when Miss Carlin replicated it, deliberately flawed, none of you objected, because none of you found it strange, because some of you had already tasted it, in Zurich, at Halbrecht's table, or at his auction." Delacourte spoke now, her voice low. "You have no right to dredge this up. The matter was closed." "By lies," Wolfe said. "Fliss confessed to spare someone, but the ledger he kept was meticulous. Miss Harrow, I believe your signature appears most frequently." She blanched. "And Mr. Beasley," Wolfe went on, "your correspondence with the Zurich office, encrypted but shallow, was decrypted yesterday by my associate. Would you like to hear the amounts transferred?" Beasley stood up. "You have no authority." "No," Wolfe said, "but the Department of Cultural Preservation does. And as of this morning, they have received a full transcript of our findings, including Fliss's statement." He paused. "However, I offered you this meal not as prosecution, but as courtesy, to let you know, before it becomes public, that the theft of flavor is no longer hidden in silence." Morath had not moved. Now she looked at Wolfe, steadily. "What do you want from us?" Wolfe reached into a side drawer and withdrew a single envelope. "Restitution. formal admission, the public restoration of the archive, and the full clearing of Fliss's name. Silence. Tense. Crisp. Then Morath, without blinking, took the envelope. Very well. The others said nothing. Wolfe nodded once to Fritz, who entered with a silver tray and cleared the bowls. The soup was finished. So was the matter. Later, after the guests had left in uneven silence and the dining room had been restored to its usual sanctity, Wolfe returned to his chair. "You realize," I said, "that was the first time I've seen you solve a case over dinner. Literally." "It was appropriate," he said. "They tried to bury history with herbs. I merely served it back to them." "And the soup?" He closed his eyes. "Not perfect," he murmured, "but honest." I didn't have a response for that, so I poured myself a small brandy and toasted the only detective in New York who could weaponize regret and garnish it with rosemary. The morning after the soup summit, the brownstone was unusually quiet. Not the usual kind of Wolfe quiet, which is built into the structure like the plaster and wood trim, but the kind that feels intentional, like someone had slammed the door on a chapter and didn't care if the hinges remembered. Wolfe had retired to the plant rooms after breakfast without a word, his gait steady but, to my eye, reflective. Fritz moved in calm silence through the kitchen, cleaning copper with a precision I'd only seen during his more philosophical moods. As for me, I'd started sifting through the aftermath, both literal and symbolic. The dining room still carried the faint trace of rosemary and anise. Fritz had aired it out, but that kind of aroma has staying power. It had soaked into the wood, the linens, maybe even the memory of the walls. Wolfe would like that. He appreciated the permanence of things, especially the ones tied to scent and silence. At 10:42, the phone rang. I picked it up expecting Saul or maybe someone from the Department of Cultural Preservation who'd gotten our little present wrapped in Fliss's notes and Saul's documentation. But it wasn't either. It was Eleanor Carlin. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, voice tighter than before. "May I speak to Mr. Wolfe?" "He's in with the orchids." "Then please tell him I've received a letter. Anonymous, no return address. It was hand-delivered. I believe it's a threat." That got my full attention. "What kind of threat?" "It says, 'You don't know what was really taken.' And there's a drawing. Of a flower. I held the phone a moment longer than necessary. "What kind of flower?" "Something stylized. Twisting petals. Very dark ink. But it looks almost venomous." I didn't know what to make of that, but I knew Wolfe would want to hear it himself. I told her to stay put and hung up. Wolfe was mid-prune when I reached the plant rooms. I opened the door and was met with warm air and the perfume of 1,000 unreasonable flowers. Wolfe didn't look up, but he always knew when I brought something into the room that didn't belong. "Miss Carlin has received a threat," I said. "Anonymous, delivered by hand, says she doesn't know what was really taken." He clipped a stem. "Was it signed?" "Number, but it included a flower drawing. Stylized. Twisting petals. She says it looked venomous." Now he looked up. "Describe it." I didn't see it. "She called just now." He set the pruning shears down carefully. "We'll receive her here within the hour. Call her. Then summon Saul. Have him check the security footage around her building. Anyone delivering anything by hand to that address is either brazen or stupid. Either way, I want a face." I nodded. "You think it's connected to the Zurich crowd?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that someone involved with the archive is not satisfied with silence. They may have complied last night, but compliance, Mr. Goodwin, is not the same as remorse." Miss Carlin arrived just before noon, wearing the same deliberate calm she'd brought the first time. But this time, she looked less like someone sending a message and more like someone trying not to receive one. She handed Wolfe the envelope. It was unmarked, cheap paper, folded once, with no postage. the kind of thing you'd slide under a door if you didn't want to be seen doing it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Centered in the middle was a drawing, black ink, sharp lines, petal edges that curled like hooks. I'm not a botanist, but even I could tell it wasn't a flower you'd send with condolences. It's not just art, Wolfe said. It's a signal, an kairos. Gesundheit, I said. He gave me a look. It's a rare genus of orchid, toxic in high concentrations, symbolic in Greek funerary rites, and, he held up the page, also the emblem of a very old culinary society known as the Seven Mouths. I blinked. The what now? The Seven Mouths, he repeated. An informal guild of gastronomes, chemists, and collectors who believed that flavor was a moral compass, that the rarest spices, those with histories soaked in blood or empire, had to be safeguarded from unworthy hands. Miss Carlin leaned forward. I've read about them. They're considered fringe, obscure. Some claim they never existed. Oh, they existed, Wolfe said. Their records are sparse but real. Mostly oral. Half myth, half manifesto. But this symbol, this is theirs. And you think someone connected to the Institute is part of it? She asked. I think someone was more than connected. I think someone joined their cause. Perhaps long ago. And when the Institute began quietly selling rare spices to private buyers, this person took it personally. Saul arrived as we were still circling the implications. He handed me a tablet with security footage paused at 7:14 that morning. A man in a dark wool coat, face obscured by a scarf and hat, dropping something into Eleanor's mailbox. Not much to go on, Saul said. But we can run gait analysis. Height and stride suggest someone around 5 feet 8 inches. Right-handed, possibly favoring his left leg. Watch the pivot as he turns. Wolfe waved that aside for the moment. Saul, have you heard of the Seven Mouths? Saul nodded. Twice, once in Berlin during a spice forgery case, once from a collector who had to earn access to a vault in Morocco, said the Mouths judged his worth. Find out if any of our recent guests are linked to them. Deep archives. No headlines. Look for patterns in travel, auctions, contacts with rare culinary preservationists. Saul didn't need more than that. He vanished. Wolfe turned back to Eleanor. You're not just a messenger anymore, he said. You're a threat to whoever believes this archive betrayal violated something sacred. I didn't name names, she said. I only wanted truth. To some, Wolfe said quietly, truth is desecration. I escorted her home again, but this time I stayed, while Fritz made us a sharp tisane, lemon verbena, ginger, and a single crushed clove. I scanned the house for signs of intrusion. Nothing. No broken locks, no tampered windows. But someone had been close enough to hand-deliver that letter without being seen. As we sat at her small table, she turned the drawing slowly in her hands. Do you think it was meant to scare me off? No, I said. I think it was meant to see how far you'd go. She looked up. And if I don't stop? Then, I said, they'll stop hiding. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was reviewing a new set of pages from Fliss's notes. Pages that had been missing until that morning, sent by courier from the hospice. In the margins, one line stood out, underlined twice. Some flavors are meant to be remembered. Others only survived. Wolfe looked at me. Archie, we are no longer in the realm of theft or deception. We are in the realm of ideology, and ideology rarely forgives. He handed me the drawing. Prepare yourself. The next course will not be served warm. The phrase Wolfe had muttered, the next course will not be served warm, stuck in my mind as I headed into the kitchen to let Fritz know we might need a lighter supper. Something digestible under pressure. Fritz, ever the prophet of palate and psychology, nodded once and started peeling cucumbers like they'd betrayed him in a past life. In the office, Wolfe was seated motionless with the drawing Eleanor had received pinned beside a photostat of the old Colette ledger. On the opposite end of his desk, he had spread out pages from Fliss's final package. Addenda scrawled in a slanted, exhausted hand. Cross-referenced dates, auction code names, and something I hadn't seen before. A list of initials circled with thick pencil. There were 7 of them. "You think these are our mouths?" I asked, tilting the sheet. "I think they are the last ones Fliss suspected were operating inside the Institute under the guise of stewardship," Wolfe replied. He believed the 7 mouths weren't a legend. He believed they infiltrated the board, or were the board at some point. But all we've got are initials. Not exactly actionable. "No," Wolfe admitted, "but coupled with travel records, auction catalogues, and encrypted transactions, which Saul is now unwinding, they become a map." At that moment, as if summoned by relevance, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered. A moment later, he appeared in the office doorway holding a slip of paper with the gravity of someone delivering a verdict. "Another note," he said. "No envelope. Tucked into the screen door." He handed it to Wolfe. I crossed the room to look. It wasn't typed or scrawled in haste. The letters were neat, symmetrical, monastic in their regularity. "You misread the recipe. Stop now, or the next tasting will burn." Wolfe said nothing, just held the slip like it might change texture in his hand. "I think they've just served the amuse-bouche," I muttered. "They've served their impatience," Wolfe replied, "and revealed their proximity. No postage, no delivery service. We are being watched." "Want me to have a look around the block?" "No," he said. "Whoever is doing this is too careful. They know not to approach during peak hours, but they've made an error. Their style, the handwriting. Number, the phrase, 'You misread the recipe.' That's language used among formulists. Spice theorists. That's not standard threat jargon. That's someone thinking like a palate chemist, which, in Wolfe's world, meant someone who cooked with secrets instead of salt." I stood back, arms crossed. Could be Carlin's being baited. Maybe she was right and did miss something. "She missed nothing," Wolfe said. "She simply struck a nerve." That afternoon, Saul returned with preliminary names linked to the circled initials in Fliss's papers, cross-checked with Colette's internal meeting rosters, shipping manifests from Zurich, and 2 private donor files leaked by an anonymous source. Anonymous in this case, meaning the file had shown up in a plastic bag outside Saul's car. The initials matched: E.M., Eloise Morath; L.H., Lydia Harrow; C.B., Colum Beasley; M.A., Marcus Averill; D.C., Delacorte; J.T., Jeremy Thane; G.R., Dr. Grinley. All had been at Wolfe's table for the dinner. The 7 mouths, if that's what they were, had already tasted Wolfe's truth, and now they were sharpening theirs. Wolfe asked Saul to dig deeper, not into the finances, but into the philosophy. "I want to know who among them has published, spoken, or whispered anything about culinary purity, the ethics of rarity, preservation as gatekeeping, academic manifestos?" Saul asked. "Published or suppressed? Either will do." The rest of the evening passed in that particular brownstone hush that means minds are being armed. Wolfe stayed in the office. I scanned old board interviews, notes, and a 1997 lecture transcript from Eloise Morath about the moral function of spice narrative. Not exactly a thriller, but it had moments. Specifically, one line: "In times of dilution, the rarest ingredients must be hidden, not offered. Their power is diminished by consumption." I circled that. At midnight, just as I was about to tell Wolfe to call it a day before his grey matter fried, the phone rang again. I picked up. "Goodwin." "This is Eleanor." Her voice was flat, hollow. "I went out for milk," she said. "Gone 10 minutes. I came back and someone had been inside." I straightened. "Are you hurt?" Number nothing's broken, But someone went through the drawers. My notes are gone. The only thing left was a gift. I waited. A spoon, she said. Silver. Curved, a single drop of something black on the bowl. I said nothing for a beat. Then, leave the house. Now get a cab and come here. Bring the spoon in a sealed bag if you can. She didn't argue. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. They've escalated. Broke into her place. Took her notes. Left her a spoon with something on it. Wolfe's eyes closed. An ace oil, he said. On silver, a callback to the original symbol. Symbol or warning. He opened his eyes again. Both. They're telling her she's already tasted the poison. 20 minutes later, she was at our door, pale and silent, a plastic sandwich bag in her hand. Inside, a tarnished spoon glinting under the hall light. Fritz brought tea. Wolfe asked her to sit. I fetched an evidence dish and tweezers and laid the bag open under the desk lamp. He examined it like a gemstone. Smell, Mr. Goodwin. I did. It wasn't as harsh as anise should have been. It had an earthy undertone, something resinous. Then I recognized it, barely. Camphor. And galbanum, Wolfe said. A blend used in antique tinctures, also found in old embalming mixes. Not lethal here. Symbolic. Ritualistic. He set the spoon down. They're marking her as impure. Eleanor stared at him, stunned. I've done nothing but speak the truth. To people like this, Wolfe said, truth is theft. And thieves are defiled. I offered to drive her to a hotel. Wolfe vetoed it. She stays here, tonight. Fritz will prepare the guest room. She must not be followed, and she must not be alone. Fritz took her upstairs. Wolfe folded his hands and leaned back. His voice, when it came, was nearly a whisper. Tomorrow, we end it. How? I asked. He looked toward the spoon. By serving them the only thing they cannot consume. Which is? He looked at me. Tired, resolute. Exposure. By dawn, the brownstone had shifted from sanctuary to staging ground. The air was tense but quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before something permanent gets written into the record. Fritz moved through the kitchen like a surgeon prepping for an irreversible procedure, boiling water with a deliberateness usually reserved for his sources. Upstairs, Eleanor was awake before either of us, dressed in the same coat she'd worn the night before, her hands folded neatly on her lap like she was preparing to take the stand. Wolfe, seated in his office chair with a spoon from the night before resting in a linen-lined tray on the desk, had already made his decision. He had dictated 3 letters, 2 to media outlets that would understand discretion wrapped in exclusivity, and 1 to the head of the Department of Cultural Preservation. All included Fliss's list, the ledger, transcripts of the Zurich vault sales, and photographs of the anise-streaked spoon, galbanum trace and all. A story about spices had just become a story about sabotage, and Wolfe intended to serve it with garnishes sharp enough to draw blood. At 9 o'clock sharp, he instructed me to place 7 calls. I knew the drill. The same 7 who'd sat at our dinner table, Morath, Harrow, Beasley, Delacorte, Averill, Thane, and Grinley, were now invited not to a meal, but to a confrontation. Wolfe had me be precise. A matter of historical and ethical urgency concerning the legacy of the Colette Institute. That line landed like a guillotine in slow motion. Each of them agreed to come. Not a single one asked who else would be there. That was telling. While Fritz prepared coffee and a restrained lunch menu. Nothing scented, Wolfe had ordered. Saul came in through the back with a padded file and a face that said the pieces had finally arranged themselves. They weren't just hiding spice, he told Wolfe, dropping the folder on the desk. They were moving people. Wolfe raised a brow. Interns, Saul continued. Junior archivists, researchers, all shuffled quietly out of the Institute over the past 10 years. Every one of them had tried to question the board's decisions. Most of them were women. Most of them had specialized in documentation, paper trails. Suppressed by displacement, Wolfe murmured. Efficient. And there's more, Saul said. Morath's name shows up in 2 off-ledger transactions from Zurich under a private collection transfer company, JDS Holdings. They're fake, but the signature authorization matches her academic funding applications. Wolfe looked toward the spoon. She is the mouth that bit deepest. The first guest arrived at 10:43. Morath, again, fashionably late and unsmiling, her coat tailored and her eyes fixed straight ahead. She was followed by Grinley, Harrow, and the rest, each settling into the red chairs with the same wary glances and brittle small talk you'd hear at a wake where everyone wonders if they're next. Wolfe did not stand when he addressed them. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room like a pressure drop. "I've asked you here," he began, "because truth, like spice, does not improve with concealment." Beasley shifted in his seat. "Is this more about Fliss?" "No," Wolfe said. "This is about all of you, and what you chose to preserve by omission." He gestured to the tray. Saul uncovered the spoon. "The 7 mouths," Wolfe continued, "existed. Still do. You used secrecy as sanctity. You trafficked in ideology while masquerading as preservationists. And when Eleanor Carlin attempted to correct the record, you marked her for desecration." Delacourte hissed a breath. "You have no proof." "I have correspondence," Wolfe cut in. "Shipping records, encryption keys, payments routed through Zurich and split among JDS Holdings and its archival partners. And I have one more thing. Confession." He opened a folder and slid out a handwritten letter. "Fliss dictated this before he died. He names each of you. He outlines your methods. He cites Eleanor Carlin as the one who tried to stop you." The room went still. "You used an ancient emblem," Wolfe said, tapping the spoon with a pen, "to communicate your judgment, to enforce silence. But judgment, when imposed without accountability, ceases to be moral. It becomes tyranny. And tyranny has no claim to history." Morath's lips parted. "You think publishing this will fix it? You'll destroy the Institute. The archive will collapse. That history will vanish." "No," Wolfe said, calm as a glacier. "It will be liberated." There was no shouting, no protest, just the dull sound of reputations calcifying. "I will give you one option," Wolfe said, his eyes sweeping over the table. "Collectively, you will draft a formal statement admitting to the concealment of rare artifact sales, naming those involved, and recommending full restitution. You will send it under the Institute's letterhead before the day is out, and you will sign it." Averill swallowed. "If we refuse?" "Then the media receives everything," Wolfe said, "and I assure you they will not ask you to explain over coffee." No one answered. That was answer enough. By noon, the room had emptied. Morath was the last to leave, her silence brittle, her shoulders set like steel rods under silk. When the door closed behind her, Wolfe exhaled. Not triumphantly, just finally. Eleanor stepped forward. She had said nothing throughout, but now her voice returned. "That's it?" "That," Wolfe said, "is exposure. And exposure, Miss Carlin, is the one ingredient no ideology can withstand indefinitely." She nodded once. "Fliss would have liked that." "He already does," Wolfe said softly. "Some truths arrive only when they're ready." I walked her to the door. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The weight had shifted. The ledger balanced, at least for now. Back in the office, Wolfe was seated with his eyes closed. I started to say something about lunch, but he raised a hand. "Later," which meant he was listening, not to me, but to the silence. The kind of silence that only comes when something long buried has finally been laid out in the light. I poured myself a brandy. Wolfe didn't open his eyes, but he spoke. "There's a difference, Archie," he murmured, "between those who season food and those who season history. Yeah, I said. What's that? He opened his eyes. Food forgives. That night, the brownstone felt strangely empty, not quiet. Wolfe's home always had quiet built in like load-bearing beams, but hollow in a way that made you aware of the silence. The storm had passed. The thunder had been measured, catalogued, and served to its owners on Wolfe's best stationery. The board had signed the statement. The Department of Cultural Preservation had responded with a formal acknowledgement, and the press had received their embargoed copies of the truth, sanitized enough to spare the Institute's walls, but not enough to spare the reputations that had sheltered behind them. Dinner was subdued. Fritz made a warm barley risotto with thyme and aged cheese. Comfort food, but with that edge of restraint only Fritz could manage. Like even the rice understood what we'd all just come through. Eleanor joined us, though she ate little. Wolfe didn't talk, which was fine, because neither did I. The only words that passed between them were her quiet thanks, and his equally quiet, "It was necessary." They weren't at odds exactly, but something between them had shifted. They weren't allies anymore. They were witnesses. After the plates had been cleared and Fritz had disappeared into the humming depths of the kitchen, I refilled 2 brandy glasses. I set one down in front of Wolfe, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he looked out the window. The city was moving again, cars casting smeared shadows across the sidewalk. Wolfe didn't look often, but tonight he did. "You're not content," I said. "I am," he replied, "but I'm not untroubled." "Because of Eleanor?" "In part, but more because of what she represents." He turned slightly toward me. "She believed in the sanctity of flavor. That was her heresy. She saw history not as a sequence of facts, but as something aromatic, alive, layered, rich with meaning. And when that was manipulated, diluted, she rebelled." "She baked a cake," I said. "Not exactly sabotage." Wolfe didn't smile. Number it was grief. He paused, then continued. "We preserve many things. Article law, memory, but when preservation becomes hoarding, it rots. The Seven Mouths believed they were curators of virtue. They were, in fact, cowards, and afraid of what rarity means when it no longer obeys their gate. And now they have been exposed, but not erased." I took a sip of brandy. "Do you think they'll try to come back?" "No," Wolfe said. "They never left." I let that one settle. Wolfe rarely talked in riddles unless he was winding down from something large. And this case had been that, large, quiet, dangerous in the way philosophical crimes always are. Nothing explosive, just slow decay, the kind that hollows institutions from the inside and salts the earth with secrecy. Eleanor left just before 10. No fanfare, no final words. She had somewhere to be. A lecture in Vermont, she said. Something about the use of coriander in medieval ceremonial bread. Wolfe had nodded, offered a single "indeed," and turned back to his chair. After she was gone, I found myself in the kitchen with Fritz. He was washing the brandy glasses by hand, a towel over his shoulder, humming something I didn't recognize. "She's not coming back," I said. "No," he replied. "She was never meant to stay." "You liked her." "I respected her," he said, rinsing the last glass. "She understood ingredients." Wolfe respected her too, in his own way. Fritz dried his hands slowly, folded the towel, and placed it down beside the sink. "She reminded him of someone," he said finally. "Who?" He didn't answer. Just left the towel where it was and walked out of the room. I stayed up an extra hour, typing up my notes. Wolfe didn't ask for a formal report, but I knew he'd want the archive completed. Every name, every file, every spice and its signature. The soup that started it all, the spoon that ended it. I left a copy on his desk at midnight and went to bed. The next morning I came downstairs expecting the usual. Wolfe in the plant rooms, Fritz clattering softly in the kitchen, silence draped over everything like linen over furniture. But instead, I found Wolfe already in the office, seated and reading a letter, the real kind, with handwriting and a wax seal. He looked up as I entered. "From Fliss's attorney," he said. "Posthumous?" "Yes. Fliss left instructions. He wanted the final pouch of the Ottoman blend, his personal portion, donated to a culinary trust, but only on one condition." "What's that?" Wolfe handed me the letter. "To be received only if Eleanor Carlin is named its guardian." I looked at Wolfe. He was already dialing. He spoke briefly, clearly, and with finality. "Yes, Miss Carlin, it appears you've been entrusted. I suggest you use the spice as it was intended, with reverence and, perhaps, caution." A pause, then a small smile. "Yes, I imagine Fliss would have been pleased." He hung up and sat back. "You just gave her the key to a flavor war," I said. "No," Wolfe said. "I gave her responsibility." Outside, the city had begun moving again, buses groaning past, delivery vans clattering along 35th. But inside, the brownstone had returned to form, controlled, ordered, but not untouched. Wolfe reached for his brandy. "I'm ready for lunch," he said. Fritz appeared in the doorway as if summoned by scent alone. "Something new," Wolfe added. "Something unrecorded." Fritz nodded. I smiled. "You're not afraid of rare flavor anymore." Wolfe closed his eyes and said simply, "I never was." I didn't press him. Some truths don't need to be salted twice. Instead, I sat down in my red chair and let the smell from the kitchen carry over. Saffron, maybe. A whisper of clove. Something elusive. And for once, even I didn't want to know what was in the pot. Not yet. Some flavors, after all, are best served in silence. The next few days passed in that oddly weightless way the world feels after a case has closed, not with a bang, but with a carefully measured full stop. Wolfe returned to his usual rhythms like a pendulum realigning, precise down to the second. Orchids at 9, lunch at 1, and no tolerance for interruption unless it involved Fritz's sauce curdling or someone setting fire to Manhattan within a 5-block radius of the brownstone. And yet, there was something new in the air. Not a change exactly. Wolfe wasn't one for those, but an added depth, a richer timbre to the silence. Like the flavor of a good stock that had been simmering longer than anyone expected, until it revealed something unexpected beneath the surface. Eleanor Carlin sent a letter, handwritten, thick paper, no perfume, no posturing. She thanked Wolfe for his help, his caution, and I noted with some amusement, his unrelenting refusal to let sentiment interfere with judgment. She also enclosed a photograph. It was a black and white image of Fliss taken some years earlier. He was standing in the archive, holding a spice jar in one hand and pointing at a chart with the other. He looked ordinary, focused, alive. On the back, she had written in small, even script, "Some things should be remembered, not protected. Thank you for remembering him." Wolfe read the note twice, set it on his desk, and didn't comment, which in his language meant he understood. As for the Institute, they issued their statement the following week. Dry, official, tight-lipped, but clear enough. A formal acknowledgement of improper archival dispersals, mishandling of donations, and a significant lapse in ethical oversight. Names were named. Resignations followed. And the vaults, both literal and metaphorical, were reopened, this time with actual transparency instead of curated secrecy. The 7 mouths, if they still existed, had fallen silent. Fritz, perhaps sensing the moment, prepared something special that Sunday. He refused to say what it was, but when the lid came off the tureen at lunch, I caught a scent I hadn't expected to smell again. Rosemary, lemon, parsnip. Yes, but this time balanced against something deeper. A whisper of anise, yes, but mellowed, forgiven, transformed. Wolfe tasted it. He didn't speak, just set down his spoon, folded his napkin with deliberate precision, and leaned back in his chair. "Fritz," he said, "you've done it." That was all. No applause, no sermon, just that quiet benediction, uttered like a judge closing a case, not with gavel or decree, but with a simple truth. After lunch, Wolfe returned to the office and picked up one of his unread books. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the sunlight stretch across the rug in that long, late afternoon way that makes the whole city seem like it's holding its breath. "You know," I said, "it's still a little weird that it all started with soup." Wolfe didn't look up. "Everything starts with soup, Archie. One way or another. Poetic." "No," he said, turning a page. "I'm merely observant." I smiled, sipping the coffee. Outside, the city returned to its usual hum. Inside, the brownstone had regained its equilibrium. Cases would come again, as they always did. Another knock, another disruption, another mystery just complex enough to rouse Wolfe from philosophical slumber. But for now, we had silence and broth, and the knowledge that for once, the truth had not just been uncovered, but served. And in Wolfe's world, that was justice. Justice with a side of regret. And maybe, just maybe, a touch of rosemary.